Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 2020 observance of African American History Month. My name is Kevin Bailey, Deputy Director of the Office of Civil Rights, and I'm very honored to serve as your MC for today's program. Every February, our nation acknowledges the history of African Americans. This is a history of contributions to this country, individual and group achievements, pain and despair, wins and losses. But nonetheless, a history that is an indispensable part of the fabric of this country. And the father of this celebrated month, Carter G. Woodson, understood that emphatically. The origins of African American History Month are steeped in education. In its first iteration as Negro History Week, which began in the 1920s, it was envisioned as an opportunity for educational institutions to focus their teaching on the history of Black people in this country. The transition from a week-long celebration to a month-long celebration happened in the late 1970s. However, the focus is still the same: educating people about the history of African Americans in this country and affirming the importance of that history. I hope you enjoyed today's program, as we are honored to have a guest speaker who I believe embodies everything that Carter G. Woodson would have envisioned for the future of African American History Month. But before we get to our guest speaker, I would like to welcome Donna Vizian, the Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Mission Support, to the podium to provide a few remarks. Donna?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and thank you, Kevin, for the introduction. And thanks to everyone for coming out today to hear the special remarks from our guest speaker, Ms. Deborah Tulani Salahu-Din, Museum Specialist and Expert in African American Literature at the National Museum of American History and Culture. I look forward to your remarks. The museum is a great addition for those seeking to learn more about the African American experience and all the contributions made to our nation. Doug Benevento, our Associate Deputy Administrator, sends his regards. He was supposed to be here today to address the group also, but was unexpectedly called to the Hill yesterday. So it's an honor to be here with you today as we recognize and acknowledge African American History Month. The Office of Mission Support hosts national observant events and is also responsible for supporting Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee. Along with the Office of Civil Rights, we partnered to increase diversity and ensure our workforce feels included. That is why programs such as today's is so important. This is the opportunity to not only highlight the great work being done by the agency, but also to share and acknowledge the impact we all have on the agency and this great nation. I believe it's important to us to share in the experience of those outside of our own culture. We can all learn from each other, and we are a better workforce when we are a more inclusive workforce. As an agency, we can better serve our customers when we have diversity of experience, thought, and culture. Our multi-year diversity and inclusion strategic plan sets the roadmap for goals we strive to accomplish as an agency each year. We are very proud of the accomplishments of the DIAC and the commitment of our members. A special thanks to those in our audience who are members of the DIAC. Goal 1 of the strategic plan is to diversify the federal workforce through achievement engagement of leadership. This leadership goal is addressed through training, increasing career development opportunities, and increasing activities with minority-serving institutions. I want to give you an example from last year. The agency provided funds in the support of linking environmental and academic programs with the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Contract funds were used to develop a green infrastructure curriculum and a certificate program focused on urban and coastal green infrastructure education and field experience. I also want to mention that various programs and regional offices have provided funds to support individual career fairs at various historically Black colleges and universities across the country. In fact, we doubled the funding in 19 from what we spent in 18. So I'd encourage you to read our strategic plan on the website and continue to support our observance events, because as I mentioned, it's a really important way to celebrate the diversity of our workforce. I appreciate the time to talk to you all today, and thank you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kevin.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Donna. Now, all that stands between you and our guest speaker is me, but I thought I'd share a few words about her before I asked her to the podium. Ms. Deborah Tulani Salahu-Din is an educator and researcher in African American history and culture. Underlying her work in education and public history is the belief that cross-cultural education is a prerequisite to mutual understanding, respect, and tolerance among individuals and groups. She maintains that within a national and international context, cross-cultural bridges can help resolve conflict, avert clashes of culture on both groups, personal and organizational levels. Since 2010, Ms. Tulani Salahu-Din has served as a researcher in the Office of Curatorial Affairs at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture here in the district. As a museum specialist, she has developed content for exhibitions, collected artifacts for the museum's national collection. Ms. Salahu-Din was part of the creative curatorial team that developed the Making a Way Out of No Way Gallery, the Military Gallery, and the special exhibition on the African American experience in World War I. Her area of expertise is 20th century African American literature, specializing in the works of writer and activist James Baldwin. She curated the museum's first exclusively digital exhibition titled Shea Baldwin, an exploration of James Baldwin's life and work through the lens of his house, Shea Baldwin in St. Paul de France. That was all the French I know. I actually practiced that too for this. Anyway, researching and writing about historical figures, literary movements, and historical events of the 19th and 20th centuries, and collecting material culture has been an integral part of her work within numerous other museums. The Booker T. Washington Monument in Hardy, Virginia, the Reginald F. Lewis Museum in Baltimore, and the Great Blacks and Wax Museum, also in Baltimore. Developing her career along dual lines, Ms. Salahu-Din was a full-time faculty member at the Morgan State University Department of English and Language Arts, where she taught basic and advanced composition, research methods, African American literature, and cultivated her initial interest in the life and works of James Baldwin. Her research interests at Morgan also included the effects of topic variation on the writing performance of basic writers. Ms. Salahu-Din's teaching career began in 1984 at Coppin State in Baltimore, where she taught composition and first began her work in basic writing pedagogy. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from Coppin State, a Master of Arts in Rhetoric and Composition at Salisbury University, and credits toward the Doctorate in African American Literature at Howard University. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Deborah Tulani Salahu-Din.
Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. I'd first like to thank Kevin for that very warm introduction, and I'd like to thank Sharon Hilliard for facilitating my visit here and all of those who worked with her to make my visit possible. So I have been working with the museum for about 10 years now, and in fact, June will be 10 years exactly. And when I started working with the museum, believe it or not, there were only about 20 staff members, 20 curators and museum specialists and research assistants, and we were tasked with the responsibility of developing content and collecting artifacts for the inaugural exhibitions. So as Kevin mentioned in his introduction, I was very active in developing the Making a Way Out of No Way Gallery, as well as the Military Gallery. And working with the Military Gallery, I was actually stepping outside of my area of expertise because as you heard from the introduction, my area of expertise is African American literature. But because our staff was so small, many of us had to step outside of our disciplines. And so I learned a heck of a lot about military, more than I probably cared to know. In fact, I only knew about military I think all of us probably have had members of our family who have been in the military. So growing up, I had cousins who had gone into the military. And then my father, who is a Korean War veteran, I encouraged him to write his memoir of the Korean War. He served in 1952 at 9 months of brutal combat. And so he wrote his memoir of the Korean War. And so it was only with that frame of reference that I began working with our military curator, Tulani Salahu-Din, who is now the director of the 1st Division Museum outside of Chicago. But he and I have worked together for about 8 years doing military exhibitions. So this, We Return Fighting, is a special exhibition that opened in December. And it's, what prompted it was that it's the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. It ended in 1919. So 2019 was the 100th anniversary, and we began working on it probably at the beginning, no, actually in 2018, we began working on it. And so that's what the focus of my discussion will be today. We Return Fighting, and I hope all of you will come to the museum it's on the concourse level, our special exhibitions gallery, to see We Return Fighting. Now, World War I was a major conflict, as you know, involving, first of all, some European nations, Germany and France, and then Russia, and so the conflict began as early as 1914. The United States did not join until 1917. And so before I talk about our joining of the war, I want to play this video that just gives you a brief overview of the exhibition.
The Great War, a global war. No one knew and few imagined how the outcome of this war would affect the world. Empires fell, maps were redrawn, and the lives of countless people around the world would never be the same. In 1917, America entered the war. President Woodrow Wilson had argued before a joint session of Congress that war was necessary in order that the world be made safe for democracy. Drafted in high numbers, African Americans were sent to serve in segregated units. They left home and fought across France. Then they returned home to continue fighting for the democracy they never knew. The Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture presents We Return Fighting, the African American Experience in World War I. This exhibition probes wartime conditions at home and abroad, the discrimination, the roles of African American women, the all-black units who served alongside the French. See the history of the war from the fresh perspectives of luminaries such as W.E.B. Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, and others. We Return Fighting is an in-depth exploration of how instrumental this war was in changing the African American experience at home and abroad.
So a few important facts to know about the war. 17 to 21 million people lost their lives, if you can imagine. 17 to 21 million men, women, and some children as well. There were 400,000 African American troops who enlisted in the war. 200,000, half, were sent to France, and then the other half remained here at home. The exhibition, as you see reflected in this wartime storyline, is divided into 3 sections. The first section we refer to as pre-war. We focus on the state of Black America at the time of the war. And then the second component as you enter into the gallery is during the war. So there's a heavy focus on military. And then the post-war focuses on the cultural impact of the war and the fact that World War I planted the seed for what would become the civil rights movement. And so that's why, if we look closely at the dates, we're not looking just at the period of the war, but for the pre-war, we have 1865 to 1917. Why 1865? What's significant about that year? Civil War, okay, all right. So we wanted to highlight the fact that African Americans who served and those who didn't had expectations about participating in the war, just as they did about participating in the Civil War. They expected that their service would earn them fair treatment and full citizenship. And so these same expectations arose at the beginning of World War I. The state of Black America, well, socially, politically, economically. It was the rise of the KKK. There was racial violence, riots, lynchings were on the rise. Economically, sharecropping was pervasive, basically perpetual peonage. Also, just inequities all across the board. So all of these social, political, and economic disparities were pervasive during that time. And so African Americans said, well, you know, we have to continue our work toward fixing this problem, maybe going to serve in the war. Now, there were two arguments that prevailed. One by W.E.B. Du Bois. We've all heard of Du Bois, the scholar, one of the founders of the NAACP. He encouraged African American participation. On the other hand, A. Philip Randolph, Union man, founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, he discouraged African American participation. In fact, when President Woodrow Wilson gave his speech before Congress saying that we must make the world safe for democracy, A. Philip Randolph said, I'd rather make Georgia safe for the Negro. And so these arguments were very pervasive, but ultimately W.E.B. Du Bois's argument won because we did participate, and we participated quite fully. In that pre-war section, you will see photographs, graphics, artifacts associated with the NAACP, which was founded in 1909, and they were championing the cause of African American people. You'll see artifacts associated with the agricultural South because of the sharecropping. You will see images of the two luminaries, we refer to them as luminaries, that I mentioned, Du Bois and A. Philip Randolph, because their arguments took place during that period. So you will see large-scale posters of those two individuals. As you move into the second section, during the war, this is the center of the exhibition. Some of the highlights there, few people know that certain medical advancements were made as a result of World War I. During World War I, trenches were dug, deep trenches, and the soldiers, the troops, would be down in the trenches. And when they would lift their heads, bullets would be flying. And so soldiers sustained multiple facial injuries during that time. And so as a result of these types of injuries, advancements were made in facial reconstruction. Advancements were also made in the development of prosthetic limbs because of World War I, just because of the massive number of people who were injured. Also in this section, you will see a diagram which explains to you the division, how the troops were organized. There were two major divisions that African Americans served in, the 92nd Infantry and the 93rd Infantry. The 92nd was an infantry of draftees. The 93rd was comprised of National Guardsmen. And they were the ones who ultimately served on the battlefield in combat alongside the French. Now remember, segregation in the United States, segregation in the military. African American troops had separate facilities and they trained separately. And they were not permitted to fight in combat. And it wasn't because anyone was concerned about their physical well-being, being hurt or killed. There were other reasons, and we can talk about those. But the French, who did not have legal segregation, allowed the men to fight. And at the top, you probably saw the helmet. It was the Adrian helmet, the French helmet. The African American troops wore the French Adrian helmet in battle, and they fought with great vigor and with great valor. Also in that section is a wonderful photo gallery. Images of mostly of men, they're all men, who served, and people have the opportunity to look at some of those photos and perhaps recognize members of their family, their descendants. Because you can actually, even though the gallery goes high up and some of the photos are high, there's an interactive media piece that you can touch, and the images will appear on this screen, replete with all of their names and when they served and all of that. So if people are interested in looking up someone and identifying someone, they can do that. Also in that gallery is a section on how the men survived. How do you survive in wartime? So you have a shelter half, which is pretty much where they lived, you know, canteen, tools associated with eating and things of that nature, cups. You also have in that section the role of women. There were 3 women who were sent there, and they were part of the YWCA. And so they had a role in that war as well. Then the third section is the post-war section. And so as you exit out, you will see a major object that is on loan to us from the Library of Congress. And it is a huge flag, and it says, "A man was lynched yesterday." And the NAACP used to fly this flag outside of its office in New York whenever there was a lynching. And why do we return to the issue of lynching? Because when the African American troops returned home, they did receive a hero's welcome parade in New York. However, it wasn't long after that they began being attacked. Riots ensued. The Red Summer Riot of 1919, for example. Claude McKay wrote about it in a poem, If We Must Die, Let It Be Not Like Hogs, Hunted and Penned in an Inglorious Spot, while round us barked the mad and hungry dogs, making their lot at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood will not be shed in vain. And so African American soldiers in uniform were snatched off the streets and lynched and beaten during this time. Many other civilians were attacked. And why was this? They thought that their participation was going to earn them fair treatment, better treatment, full citizenship. But the racist attitudes of the time said that you must know your place. Don't think that because you went and served this country that it's going to earn you anything. So stay in your place. So what happened? This kind of intensified violence hastened and intensified consciousness among African Americans. The notion of the new Negro evolved, and it was a new way of thinking and being. And it said, we Negroes who create now, Langston Hughes, intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear, without shame. And so there was this major upsurge in African American creativity, in literature, in visual art, in performance, dance, every genre. And so we know this as the Harlem Renaissance or the new Negro Renaissance, because it was not just limited to Harlem, but in every major urban center across the nation, there was creativity, an upsurge, a flowering, and even in some rural areas as well. Also in this same section, we're talking about the 1920s now. The Harlem Renaissance lasted through pretty much halfway through the 1930s, but it began 1920s, right after, at the end of the war in 1919. A parallel artistic movement was developing at the same time in the 1920s in Paris, in France. And what caused that movement to evolve? Well, many of the soldiers who had experienced a taste of equality in France decided, some of them decided they were going to remain in France. Some decided they were going to return to France. And they brought people back with them, family members and friends, and other people who heard stories about a society where there was no legal segregation. They too came to France. And in France, there developed an artistic community called Montmartre. And it was replete with jazz clubs and cabarets, and many of the artists who lived in the United States came to perform in these places. They came just to perform. And then many of them loved it, and they stayed. And you know some of their names. Josephine Baker, probably the most beloved, you know. She ultimately received France's highest civilian honor. And many of the great jazz artists and classically trained vocalists such as Marian Anderson, Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, Noble Sissle, U.B. Blake. All of these individuals were regulars or made their home in France. And then the white musicians, the European musicians, loved the music. They loved the music. They felt that it was original, authentic. They recognized it as different, and it was something, not common to their ear, but they loved it. They flocked to the cabarets and the jazz clubs and in Montmartre and throughout Paris. And the musicians didn't remain just in France. They toured all of the Western European nations. And so today, when you go to Europe, you hear jazz. I think jazz is more popular in Europe than it is here. I was in England a few weeks ago, London, in the restaurant and hotel, go down and get a bite to eat, and there's jazz circulating through the speakers. Hop in the taxi, turn on the radio, there's jazz playing on the radio. And so you hear the music throughout Europe. It's a universal language in Europe. And in fact, there's a major jazz club in London, and that night I had just learned about it. I wish I had known in advance because all the tickets were sold out and I really wanted to go. And this is a British nightclub hosting the National Scottish Jazz Orchestra playing jazz, the roots of which has its roots in African American music. So a major merger of cultures and cultural expressions occurring there. And so yes, it's very popular. So in the gallery, you're going to see these parallel artistic movements, the Harlem Renaissance or the New Negro Renaissance, as well as what's called Paris Noir or Black Paris. And they are physically parallel in the exhibition to show that they were parallel temporally as well. And so that was a design element because, as you know, the curatorial team, the content team, we work with a design team, and we sit down and we flesh out these ideas, and the design team comes up with wonderful ways, to be able to create and engage the visitor in that content. And so you'll notice, why do you think we end with 1963? Big leap from 1919 to 1963. What's significant about that year? Okay. Someone say March on Washington? Yes, okay. So we say that that World War I, one of its effects was that it planted the seed for what we know as the modern civil rights movement. It planted the seed. And so we end with a large photograph and a media piece, and in that photograph, along with Dr. King and Congressman John Lewis, is the same luminary that we began with, who said, "I'd rather make Georgia safe for the Negro." He is now shown years later as a much older man, alongside Dr. King and all the other civil rights leaders there. In fact, let's go to the luminaries. So there we have A. Philip Randolph, who I already mentioned, who had his argument, and go to the next one. And in juxtaposition to W.E.B. Du Bois, who argued for involvement. Let's go to the next one. Ida B. Wells Barnett is featured as one of our luminaries. Ida B. Wells Barnett owned a newspaper. She was a crusader against lynching. She had a friend of hers had been lynched, and so, she was motivated to crusade and to use her newspaper for that purpose. Let's go to the next one. Colonel Charles Young, a West Point graduate, became the highest ranking African American officer during World War I. And his story is kind of sad the way that it ended. He was forced into medical retirement. He had some sort of condition. He was forced into medical retirement, but he didn't feel that that particular condition would preclude his continued service. And so, to prove his fitness, he rode his horse from Ohio to Washington, D.C. Yet his appeal was still denied. And so some scholars say, because he was in line to become, a higher ranking official, and they just wanted to basically retire him. And that's what they did. The next one. Mary Church Terrell founded the National Association of Colored Women. So these women, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Mary Church Terrell, and many other women were fighting for racial equality as well as equality for women. Next. Lieutenant Charles Hamilton Houston. We should know the name of this man. Now, years ago, when I was doing research on Brown versus the Board of Education, I learned about Charles Hamilton Houston. But I didn't do in-depth research, obviously, because at that time, I did not know that he served in World War I. And that, in fact, what motivated him to become a lawyer, a civil rights lawyer, was the inequities that he witnessed and the harsh treatment that he experienced as a soldier during World War I. So he pledged that when my service is done here, I'm going to become a civil rights lawyer, and I'm going to train a whole new cadre, a whole new generation of civil rights lawyers. And that's what he did. After he graduated from Harvard, he went on to teach at Howard Law School. Yes, right? And one of his proteges was whom? Thurgood Marshall, absolutely. Thurgood Marshall, who, as we know, became the architect of Brown versus the Board of Education, which led to school desegregation in 1954. And so, yes, so learning so much, and through the development of this exhibition about how people's lives and how movements all come together, toward a particular goal or toward a particular phenomenon, cultural phenomenon. Next one. Oscar Dupree. As you know, during the Reconstruction era, we had a number of congressmen, and then we had some political setbacks. And this man, Oscar Dupree, was the first congressman. He was elected in 1928 since Reconstruction, after that setback period. So there, was this activism, this upsurge in creativity during the 1920s that included political engagement as well. Next one. And we mentioned this lady, Josephine Baker, born in St. Louis, had experienced the St. Louis riots, decided she was going to get up out of there, went to New York, worked in theater and singing, dancing, performing, and then ultimately hearing about the life, the cultural life going on in Paris, decided to pack her bags and go. And as I mentioned, that's where she remained. And I think we have one other. And of course, the role of the black press can never be underestimated. Robert Abbott founded the Chicago Defender. The black press was responsible for relating to the African American community during this period what was going on with the war. Prior to that, as all the newspapers were, from the Baltimore and Washington Afro-American, Pittsburgh Courier, they were covering activities within the African American community that were totally ignored by the mainstream newspapers. They were presenting positive activities, positive images of African Americans that countered the stereotypes that were being perpetuated in mainstream media. And so, yes, the Chicago Defender and Robert Abbott was among the giants of the Black American press. And I think that's the end of the luminaries. I would like to make certain we have time for questions and answers. How are we on time? Okay. All right. So I hope that I have shared enough with you to pique your curiosity about coming to the museum. First of all, how many of you have been to the museum? Okay. All right. Oh, fantastic. Next, how many of you have been to the We Return Fighting gallery? Okay, so I hope I've piqued your curiosity enough to come to see our special exhibition. It opened in December, and it will only be there through June. Yeah, so, yes, indeed. All right, so thank you so much. I would really love to answer any questions you may have or address any comments as well. Thank you.
First, thank you so much for the
welcome.
richness of the presentation, and I am very eager to look at the exhibit, especially now I understand we can get in on weekdays without tickets.
Yes, after 1 o'clock.
So promo on that.
Just walk in.
Just walk in for lunch.
Yes, we're
right across the
we're
street.
trying to get to the point where, eventually you can just walk in anytime, any day.
Right, terrific. This is a question about your curatorial choices. With so much material available to you, what criteria did you use to decide what to display?
For this particular,
exhibit.
Yeah, for this particular exhibition. So, there was a narrative, that we wanted to tell. And so you go out and you look for those artifacts. Then sometimes with some of the artifacts that are in that exhibition, they already were in our collection. So if we had World War I artifacts in our collection, we made certain we found a way to integrate them into the narrative that we were presenting. And that's pretty much it, the availability of artifacts.
What did you regret leaving out?
I can't think of anything at the moment.
Hi, thanks. Just a
Yes.
clarification. Yeah. So you said there was was there enlisted and drafted, or it sounded like it was they were mostly
Draftees and National Guardsmen.
So
who
National
were-
Guardsmen had signed up voluntarily.
Yes, they had signed up.
So okay, because I'm wondering how far the argument would have went if they decided as a group, African Americans, to not participate. The country does not take kindly to draft dodgers of any kind
Right.
since the Revolutionary
Yeah, oh,
War.
yeah.
So I'm wondering how far they were willing to take the movement to not participate into World War II and then into Vietnam. Like how far was the African American community willing to take it to not go? Were they going to fill up the jails? Were they going to protest? I'm just curious if you studied that part of the argument, that actually be the Randolph part of the argument.
Right. I wasn't surprised, to learn that most African Americans supported the argument of Du Bois. I mean, if you look at, say, Vietnam and, say, Muhammad Ali, for example, and how he was treated when he decided he did not want to go and fight in America's war because it was unjust. And he was treated so badly. So I just think the mentality of most African Americans at that time was not to avoid going, but they just wanted, African Americans have always wanted to support this country, be active contributors to this country, and so their fight was always just toward integration and full citizenship. And so to be a quote unquote draft dodger, that they didn't want to do that.
I'm curious as to where and how the artifacts for the exhibit were acquired, and I ask because my hometown of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had a wonderful Black Holocaust museum, which is sadly closed now, and I hope that some of those artifacts that I remember being there about World War I and forward could be utilized in some way. And you probably don't know this, but in a grand fantasy of mine, those have all been incorporated into the museum down the road. As a grand question, do you know? Are there any
Military? What's your family name?
Say again, please.
You said some of your family some of your?
No, in my hometown there was the Black Holocaust Museum, which had a large focus on World War I, African American volunteerism, as well as the lynches post World War I. And I'm wondering specifically where the artifacts came from for this exhibit.
Well, yeah, for this exhibit, there were some, as I mentioned, that were already in our collection. We took out a number of loans. We have the Library of Congress loan of the flag, and then we have several loans from museums in France. About 3 different museums in France. We had to borrow materials because their museums are rich with items, as you can imagine, because that's where the battle occurred. And then there may have been some donations from individuals. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. I think I have a comment. It may turn into a question. So, in listening to you and talking about Woodrow Wilson as President of the United States, it was difficult to learn that at that time, the President of the United States indicated that segregation was beneficial to African Americans. He had also, by that time, celebrated white supremacy by showing Birth of a Nation at the White House. And so when you were talking about the luminaries, I was trying to figure out if there were any conversations between any of those luminaries and Wilson, and if so, can you shed some light on that and what that meant in terms of encouraging African Americans to participate in the war?
Not coming to mind right now, but you're right about the birth of a nation. In fact, most scholars suggest that that helped to give rise to the KKK during that time, because this is the White House, you know, and if anyone has seen Birth of a Nation, it just perpetuates, you know, every stereotype about African Americans. And what is the function of stereotypes? Stereotypes were created to make African Americans appear subhuman. And so if they're subhuman, then perhaps we can justify treating them like animals. And so Birth of a Nation on that, presented on that national platform, had major ramifications, and giving rise to the KKK was one of those. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Salahu-Din. I think we all found that very informative. The history of the participation of African Americans in our country's military is a very long history and a profound one, and I think you're absolutely right. There's always been this call of duty to serve this country, no matter how that country had viewed us at times. So I definitely agree with that sentiment there. For it seems like the few of you that haven't had the opportunity to visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I definitely suggest that you do so. It's a wealth of information. The exhibitions are extraordinary. We are happy to have somebody who has been actively putting those exhibitions together. It looks like we have until June to see the military exhibition. So definitely get in there, get your tickets. I know it's still hard to get in there because there is a lot of interest, as the National Museum of African American History and Culture is still a jewel, and I think one of the most sought after attractions in the Smithsonian's portfolio. So if you don't get those tickets early, or if you're not in line, you know, it's just like going to the club too late, and and you don't get in. Yeah, you know. And I know some of y'all have been to the club. I know you personally, some of you personally. So, you know. But, you know, one thing Ms. Salahu-Din mentioned was the waving of the flag outside of the NAACP offices whenever a lynching has occurred. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge something extraordinary that has just happened in Congress with the passage in the House of a bill that has made lynching a federal crime. I think after more than a century, after a century of trying to make this happen, it's finally being realized, and all the expectations point to the Senate passing this and the President signing this into law. So this is very important. Now I will turn it over to Nigel Simon, who needs very little introduction around these parts. Nigel is the Director of the Office of Program Management, the Office of Land and Emergency Management, and is a great supporter of our diversity and inclusion efforts here at the agency. Nigel, please close us out.
All right, thank you, Kevin, for that kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, EPA. Wasn't that a great presentation from Ms. Deborah? Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I have two things to do, but before I do that, turn to your neighbor and says, I am Black history. Turn to your other neighbor and says, I am American history. And everyone says, and in the tradition of the ring shout, we are our ancestors' greatest dreams. So, and I also have a little quiz and we have some prizes, so stay tuned, all right? We got some goodies. But this was a great program, and thank you, Ms. Deborah. I hope everyone was enriched by the presentation and you learned something and you take it, whether it's to your children, nieces, nephews, or your family, and you talk about what this is because it's a great experience. This is American history, right? So, thanking everyone. First, Donna, thank you. Thank you for your leadership and support on many of the diversity programs that we do here. Donna is one of the champions and the co-chair of the Human Resources Council, so thank you, Donna. All right? Yes. Right? And thank you to the Office of Human Resources, and you saw Tanya Allen working very hard, right? Thank you, right? Yes. Even for the presentation, thank you. The Office of the Administrator, right? Thank you as well for the support of this program. And of course, the Office of Civil Rights with Kevin serving as our moderator today. Thank you. I normally give Kevin a little grief because he's wearing a bow tie, and if you all know me, I wear bow ties. So I'll let him have the day for today. All right, Kevin. And of course, Vicki Simmons, you heard, the Director of the Office of Civil Rights. Thank you. All right. We have some guests from Region 7, the Deputy Regional Administrator, Ed Chu. Thank you, Ed. We had our Black History Month program in Region 7 last week, and I was part of that, so thank you, Ed, for that invitation. All right? Let me just say, there's some wonderful dressed people. And I think everyone who knows me know I love fabric, know I love fashion. So thank you. I mean, some of these outfits are beautiful. I got dibs on that coat, right? And you know I'm going to rock it too, right? You know that. Okay. But thank you for a great program. Thank you for attending today, EPA. These are great programs that we always have, and I hope you continue to support not only the Black Employment Program here at EPA, but all of our diversity events that we have. All right, so we're ready for our quiz? Okay, and I know EPA, we're going to raise our hands. We're not going to yell the answers. Because we got home training, right, EPA? Right? Okay. So the first question. What month and year did the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture open? Okay, Kevin, because you're part of the program, you don't get to answer. All right, Chris?
Okay, so I'm going to say September 2016.
Yes. And that was Chris Emanuel from the Office of Civil Rights. So wait a minute, do they get a chance to do this? Wait a minute, I just thought about that.
They have nothing to do with the question.
Okay, we're just making sure for the validity of the data, right? We're EPA. Oh, okay. I'm glad I have Tanya here. So we're giving out these Black History flashcards, right? Great present for your family, all right? So, okay, thank you, Tanya. Next question. What was the name of the mathematician at NASA's Langley Research Center in Virginia? Okay, all right. So since Pete is a veteran, he's a Marine, and he thinks he knows the answer. What's the answer, Pete? All right, Pete, we'll give it to you. All right. Oh, Jim, you had it back there? Oh, you all had it? Okay, well, you have to wait for the next Black History Month question. All right, last question. What is the name of the agency's plan that directs the diversity and inclusion efforts? All of y'all who are big and bad, wave your hands, wave your hands, wave your hands, wave your hands. And Donna mentioned it. Donna mentioned it, see?
There are 3 words in the question.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, Mari?
Is it the Diversity and Inclusion Strategic Plan?
Yeah! And that was Mari Munson of the Office of General Counsel. All right, well, this concludes our program. Thank you for attending. I hope you learned a lot. Thank you again, Ms. Deborah. Appreciate it.